My dad said I'd never see my $250K again. He didn't know I recorded that conversation. That's what he told me, face to face, in the sterile conference room of his lawyer's office, the air thick with the scent of old paper and desperation. $250,000. It was supposed to be my inheritance, a trust fund set up by my grandmother for my 25th birthday. My dad, executor of the estate, had a different plan. He'd spent it. Not on himself, not on a lavish vacation, but on some ill-fated tech startup that had imploded, taking a chunk of my inheritance with it. And now, he was telling me, with that smug, superior tilt of his head, that I'd never see a dime of it again. He coughed, a dry, rasping sound, as if to punctuate his pronouncement. It's gone, sweetheart. Invested, lost. You were always bad with money anyway, always letting your emotions dictate your choices. This is a lesson for you. A hard one, but necessary. His lawyer, a man whose name I'd already forgotten, nodded sagely, as if my father had just delivered a profound truth instead of a financial death sentence. I sat there, frozen. The fluorescent lights of the office buzzed overhead, an annoying soundtrack to my own internal implosion. My mom was across the table, her eyes flicking between me and my dad, a picture of strained neutrality. She'd always been the peacemaker, the one who smoothed over my father's rough edges, but even she looked uncomfortable now, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the armrest of her chair. I don't know what I'd expected. A fight, maybe, an explanation, but not this calm, almost benevolent dismissal of my future. My 25th birthday had been a week prior, a subdued affair with just my immediate family and my grandmother's lawyer present. We'd gone over the trust documents, the final distribution details. Everything was supposed to be straightforward. The money was to be released to me directly upon my turning 25, with no strings attached. It was a significant sum, enough to give me a head start on my career, maybe even buy a small condo in a decent neighborhood without taking on a crippling mortgage. I was a junior associate at a mid-tier law firm, grinding away long hours for a salary that barely covered rent and student loans. That $250K was supposed to be a lifeline, a tangible reward for years of hard work and dedication. And my father, the man who'd preached financial responsibility to me my entire life, had gambled it away on a hunch. The conversation had started so innocently. My dad had called me, asking me to come to his lawyer's office to finalize some paperwork related to the estate. I'd assumed it was just the last bureaucratic hurdle, a formality. He'd even said, "Your mother and I will be there. We want to make sure you understand everything."
So I'd driven over, a little bit excited, a little bit anxious, the usual cocktail of emotions that came with any interaction with my father. He was a complicated man, successful, driven, fiercely intelligent, but also distant, critical, and prone to making grand pronouncements that often left my mother and me reeling. He'd built his fortune from the ground up, a self-made millionaire who'd always instilled in us the value of hard work and financial prudence. Or so he'd said. Now, sitting in that room, the words echoed in my head, a cruel mockery. You were always bad with money. He'd always subtly undermined me, belittled my financial decisions, even the small ones. When I'd bought my first car, a sensible sedan, he'd commented that I should have gone for something more reliable, something with better resale value, even though mine was in perfect condition. When I'd mentioned wanting to start a small side hustle selling handmade jewelry online, he'd waved it away with a dismissive hand, calling it a frivolous pursuit. It was a constant drip, drip, drip of doubt and criticism, designed to make me feel incapable, dependent. And it had worked, to a degree. I'd always second-guessed myself, second-guessed my choices, especially when it came to money. But this was on a whole other level. This wasn't about a silly impulse buy or a poorly researched investment. This was my grandmother's legacy, a gift intended for me, squandered by his recklessness, and then presented as my own failing. I remember the exact moment the anger started to simmer beneath the shock. It wasn't a tidal wave, more like a slow burn, a creeping realization of the depth of his deception. He wasn't just telling me the money was gone. He was telling me it was my fault for being unable to manage it, for being too emotional, too naive. He was turning a crime into a character flaw. My mother finally spoke, her voice a little too high-pitched. "Richard, are you sure? That's a substantial amount." Richard, my father. He hated when she used his first name. It always signaled she was about to push back. He turned to her, his jaw tightening. Eleanor, I've explained this. The venture capital was a calculated risk. It didn't pay off. These things happen in business. The important thing is to learn from it. And Sarah, he looked back at me, a glint in his eye that I now recognize as pure control, needs to learn. He said learn like it was some kind of punishment he was bestowing upon me. I opened my mouth to speak, to demand proof, to ask for documentation, but the words wouldn't come. My throat felt tight, constricted. The lawyer cleared his throat, pushing a file across the polished mahogany table. Your father has provided all the relevant documentation, Sarah. The investment was approved by the board of directors for the fund he managed. It was a market correction, unforeseen circumstances.
He spoke with the practiced cadence of someone who delivered similar pronouncements 1,000 times. But there was no market correction, no unforeseen circumstances that justified the complete depletion of my trust fund. I knew that, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone. My father had a history of grand, risky ventures. He'd always framed them as bold moves, visionary investments. But this time, it felt different. This time, it felt like theft. I looked at my mother, hoping for a flicker of defiance, a sign that she understood the injustice of it all. But she just offered a weak, placating smile, her gaze fixed on the polished surface of the table. She'd always been afraid of him, of his temper, of his disapproval. Her life was built around maintaining a fragile peace, and rocking the boat was simply not in her repertoire. That was my world. My father, the titan of industry, whose pronouncements were gospel. My mother, the queen of quiet desperation, whose existence was dedicated to appeasing him. And me, the dutiful daughter, perpetually striving for his approval, always falling short. The silence stretched, filled only by the incessant hum of the lights and the ticking of a ridiculously ornate grandfather clock in the corner of the room. I could feel my father watching me, dissecting my reaction, no doubt waiting for me to crumble, to cry, to beg. He liked to see people at their weakest. It affirmed his own perceived strength. But something inside me shifted in that moment. The fear, the shock, the humiliation, they began to recede, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. My father's eyes narrowed. "Leaving so soon, Sarah?" he asked, his voice laced with mock concern. I didn't answer. I walked out of the conference room, leaving them sitting there, basking in their shared delusion of financial acumen and parental wisdom. I walked out of the lawyer's office and into the bright California sunshine, the lights suddenly feeling harsh and accusatory. The city streets seemed to blur as I drove, my hands clenched around the steering wheel. The words, "You were always bad with money," replayed in my mind, each repetition a new prick of indignation. He wanted to teach me a lesson, did he? Fine, I'd learn. I'd learn to be bad with money in a way he could never have predicted. I didn't go straight home. I drove to a quiet park overlooking the ocean, the vast expanse of blue, a stark contrast to the suffocating confines of my father's world. I sat on a bench, the salty breeze whipping my hair around my face, and I let myself feel it. The rage, the betrayal, the profound sense of being utterly alone. He'd not only taken my money, but he'd also taken my trust, my belief in his integrity. And for what? Some speculative venture that had collapsed like a house of cards? My grandmother had been a shrewd investor, a woman who'd prided herself on her careful management of her finances. She'd always spoken of her children's futures with love and foresight, and my father, her eldest son, had treated her legacy like his personal piggy bank. The injustice of it all was a physical ache in my chest. I pulled out my phone, my fingers trembling slightly, and navigated to my voice memo app. I scrolled back through the recordings. Days before, after my birthday, I'd been reviewing some of my grandmother's old financial documents, looking for any tidbits of wisdom she might have left behind. I'd stumbled upon a series of recordings she'd made, dictating notes and thoughts for her future, notes that became the basis for the trust fund and eventually the foundation of my inheritance. I'd been curious, naturally. I'd wanted to hear her voice, to understand her intentions more deeply, so I'd started recording my own thoughts too, documenting my financial goals, my aspirations. And then, that afternoon, after the lawyer's appointment, I'd been so overwhelmed, so disoriented, that I'd instinctively hit record on my phone. I hadn't even realized I was doing it at first. I'd just been sitting in my car outside the office building, trying to process the conversation. And then the words had tumbled out of me, a torrent of shock and disbelief and burgeoning anger. He said I'd never see it again. $250,000. Gone. He just spent it on some stupid startup. And then he told me I was bad with money? I was bad with money? He's the one who lost it all. He looked so smug, like he'd done me a favor. Mom was there. She just sat there. She didn't say anything. It's all gone. My inheritance. My grandmother's legacy. He just took it. He just lied to me about everything. I listened to my own voice, raw and trembling, and I felt a flicker of something akin to relief. At least I had proof that he'd admitted it, proof that he'd tried to frame it as my fault. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He wanted to teach me a lesson, did he? He'd underestimated me. He'd always underestimated me. He saw me as the emotional, irresponsible daughter. He didn't see the lawyer. He didn't see the meticulous planner. He didn't see the woman who, despite his best efforts, had a mind of her own. I sat there for a long time, watching the waves crash against the shore, the sound a soothing balm to my frayed nerves. The sun began to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The anger was still there, a low thrum beneath the surface, but it was no longer consuming me. It was being channeled, transformed. I thought about the years of subtle manipulations, the constant undermining, the quiet gaslighting. He'd built his empire on control, on making others feel insignificant. And now, he'd done it to me, his own daughter, the one person he should have protected. He'd made a terrible mistake. He'd given me a reason. The drive home was different. The anger hadn't dissipated, but it had coalesced into something sharp and focused.
I was no longer just a victim. I was a wronged party, and I had a record of the crime. I walked into my apartment, the familiar scent of old books and Earl Grey tea a welcome contrast to the sterile air of my father's world. I made myself a cup of tea, my hands steady now, and sat down at my small desk. My laptop glowed invitingly. I opened a new document, the cursor blinking expectantly. I wasn't going to confront him directly, not yet. Direct confrontation was his game. He thrived on emotional outbursts, on the satisfaction of seeing others lose their composure. I would play a different game, a quieter game, a game of strategy. I started typing, not a confession, but a meticulously detailed timeline of events. The initial trust fund setup, the specific dates of my grandmother's passing and the activation of the trust, the communication I'd had with my father regarding the distribution. I noted down every conversation, every email, every interaction, no matter how seemingly insignificant. I recalled the exact phrasing he'd used, the tone of his voice, the subtle shifts in his demeanor. It was a painstaking process, dredging up memories that were both painful and now incredibly useful. I remembered the call where he'd first mentioned the exciting new investment opportunity. He'd framed it as a sure thing, a way to double the principal for me. He'd been so confident, so persuasive, that even my own cautious nature had been lulled into a false sense of security. Now, listening back to the recording, I could hear the desperation behind his bravado. I could hear the man who was clearly in over his head, trying to salvage a sinking ship with my grandmother's money. I thought about my mother. She'd always been passive, a spectator in her own life, but she'd been present. She'd heard him. She'd seen my face. Her silence was a form of complicity, but I knew deep down that she wasn't malicious. She was just broken, afraid, and perhaps in her own way, she'd believed his reassurances. He was good at that. He was good at making people believe whatever he wanted them to believe. But he'd failed to account for my own agency. He'd underestimated my resilience. He'd underestimated my anger.
I spent the next few hours meticulously organizing my thoughts, cross-referencing my memories with the audio recording. I pieced together the narrative of his deceit, building a case, brick by brick. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about the principle. It was about reclaiming my narrative. It was about showing him that his tactics, his manipulations, would no longer work. I saved the document, named it simply Project Nightingale. A small, private war. The next day at work, I was a different person. The usual nervous energy, the constant need for validation, had been replaced by a quiet confidence. I moved through the office with purpose, my focus sharp, my demeanor composed. My colleagues noticed.
"You're on fire today, Sarah," my supervising partner commented as I breezed past his office. "Working on something big?" I just smiled. "Just getting things done," I replied, the understatement a small, private victory. I started subtly researching his business dealings, the history of the startup he'd mentioned, any public records that might shed light on the situation. I used my legal skills, my access to databases, my training in investigative research. He taught me to be thorough, to leave no stone unturned. I was finally applying those lessons to him. I discovered that the startup had been dissolved 6 months ago, its assets sold off for pennies on the dollar. There were whispers of mismanagement, of fraudulent practices. It wasn't just a failed investment, it was a disaster. And he had gambled my inheritance on it, without my knowledge or consent. The more I dug, the more I realized the extent of his deception. He hadn't just lost the money, he'd likely lied about the nature of the investment itself, painting it as a legitimate, albeit risky opportunity, when it was something far more dubious. He'd used my trust fund as a lifeline for his failing ventures, a way to cover his own mounting losses. The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. He wanted me to feel shame, to internalize his failure as my own weakness. But I wouldn't. I couldn't. I was Sarah, the daughter, but I was also Sarah, the lawyer, and this was a case I intended to win. The recording sat on my phone, a digital ace up my sleeve. It was my secret weapon, the key that would unlock the truth, the undeniable evidence of his betrayal. He'd underestimated me. He thought he could control me with words, with his pronouncements of my own inadequacy. He was wrong. He had inadvertently given me the tools to fight back, to expose him, to reclaim what was rightfully mine. The humiliation of that conference room had been a catalyst. The silence that followed had been a period of reflection. Now the control was shifting, and soon, very soon, it would be my turn. I looked at the recording again, the file name a simple timestamp. My dad said I'd never see my $250K again. He had no idea. He had no idea at all. The quiet confidence I felt was a fragile thing, built on the shaky foundations of righteous anger and a carefully guarded secret. It was a shield, but one I knew could shatter under direct pressure. My father was a master strategist, a man who wielded power not through brute force, but through subtle manipulation and the erosion of his opponent's self-belief. He'd spent decades perfecting his craft, and I, his own daughter, had been his unwitting test subject for most of my life, the passive recipient of his wisdom, the emotional foil to his pragmatic genius. But the landscape had shifted. The revelation of the stolen inheritance wasn't just a financial blow, it was an existential one. It had cracked the veneer of familial devotion and exposed the rot beneath. He'd thought he could bury his transgression in the sterile formality of his lawyer's office, deliver the news with the paternalistic air of imparting a harsh but necessary life lesson. He'd banked on my reaction being one of tears and meek acceptance. He'd banked on me being the same Sarah he'd always known. He was wrong. The recording, so simple in its inception, had become my anchor, my proof of innocence in a narrative he was actively trying to rewrite. Every time I replayed it, the nuances of his voice, the false sincerity in his words, the barely concealed triumph in his tone, solidified my resolve. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about the lies, the calculated destruction of my trust, the utter disrespect for my grandmother's legacy, and by extension, for me. I began to meticulously document every financial transaction I could access related to my father's businesses, specifically the startup he'd mentioned. It was a deep dive, requiring the discreet use of my firm's resources, carefully compartmentalized so as not to raise any alarms. I was a lawyer. This was what I did. I sifted through articles of incorporation, investment prospectuses, board meeting minutes, and the sparse financial statements that were publicly available. The startup, Oratech, sounded cutting edge,
promising revolutionary AI-driven market analysis. But the more I dug, the less impressive it became. The initial seed funding was modest, the projections wildly optimistic, and the leadership team, aside from my father, was a rotating cast of characters with questionable backgrounds. One name kept surfacing: Marcus Thorne. He was listed as Chief Operations Officer, a charismatic figure who seemed to be the public face of Oratech. His background was a labyrinth of shell corporations and failed ventures, a pattern that mirrored some of my father's own past escapades, albeit on a smaller scale. Thorne was rumored to be the architect of the initial investment strategy, the one who had convinced my father that Oratech was the next big thing. My father, in his relentless pursuit of validation and his own brand of financial glory, had apparently fallen hook, line, and sinker. I found a buried news report from a local tech blog detailing Oratech's spectacular implosion. It spoke of internal disputes, allegations of financial impropriety, and a swift, messy dissolution. The article mentioned a substantial portion of the company's capital had been misappropriated by key executives, leading to its premature demise. Misappropriated. The word hung in the air, a damning indictment. My father hadn't just invested poorly. He'd been either complicit in or a victim of outright theft, and he'd chosen to conceal the truth from me, opting instead to paint me as the irresponsible party. This wasn't just a business failure. It was a betrayal of epic proportions. The thought of Marcus Thorne sent a fresh wave of nausea through me.
If my father had been swindled and he was unwilling to face that reality or admit his own gullibility, then Thorne was the likely culprit. And my father, in his desperate attempt to cover his tracks, had sacrificed my inheritance. The irony was brutal. He'd always lectured me on financial responsibility, on avoiding emotional decisions, yet here he was, a victim of his own greed and ego, covering his tracks by blaming me. The power imbalance I'd felt in that sterile conference room began to subtly shift. It was like a slow leak in a dam. The water pressure was building, and the structure was starting to groan. I wasn't just a wronged daughter. I was a lawyer armed with facts, with evidence, and with a recording that chronicled his confession. He'd underestimated the depth of my legal training, the meticulousness I'd honed under the very principles he claimed to uphold. He'd also underestimated the power of a daughter scorned. I started to revisit every interaction I'd had with my parents since my 25th birthday. The casual check-ins, the seemingly innocent questions about my life, my career, my finances. I analyzed them with a new, critical lens. Had he been probing, trying to gauge my awareness of the missing funds? Had my mother, in her quiet way, tried to signal something? I replayed their conversations in my head, searching for hidden meanings, for coded messages. My mother's constant reassurance, her gentle probing about my financial well-being, now seemed less like concern and more like a subtle attempt to keep me from digging too deep, from asking the wrong questions. "Are you managing okay, sweetheart?" she'd asked a few weeks before the lawyers' meeting. "It's a tough market out there. Make sure you're being prudent." Prudent. The word he'd used in the conference room. It was a linguistic echo, a carefully crafted narrative designed to prepare me for his pronouncement. He had been laying the groundwork, subtly conditioning me to accept his version of events. My stomach churned. He was more calculating than I had ever imagined. He hadn't just lost my money, he had orchestrated my humiliation. The realization that my mother might have been aware, or at least complicit in her silence, stung perhaps more than my father's direct betrayal. She had always been my soft place to land, the empathetic counterpoint to his granite demeanor. But in that conference room, she had chosen to be an observer, a silent witness to his injustice. Was it fear? A lifetime of ingrained obedience? Or something else entirely? I couldn't let myself dwell on that too long. My focus needed to remain laser sharp on him. He was the perpetrator. She was a secondary player, albeit an important one. I decided it was time to gather more tangible evidence, something beyond the recording and my own research. I needed to understand the flow of money, to trace where Oratech's capital had gone. This meant going deeper, getting access to records that weren't publicly available. It required a certain level of leverage. I knew my father had a complex web of offshore accounts and investment vehicles, a testament to his wealth and his desire for anonymity. Accessing those would be difficult, if not impossible, without official channels. But perhaps there were other ways. He trusted a small circle of advisors, people who'd been with him for years. One of them, a man named David Chen, handled his personal finances.
Chen was a quiet, efficient accountant, almost invisible in my father's flamboyant world. He was also, I recalled from a few brief interactions, someone who valued discretion and, I suspected, personal integrity. If anyone had insight into my father's financial dealings, it was Chen. Approaching him directly would be risky. He was loyal to my father, bound by professional ethics and likely by sheer intimidation. But I had an advantage. My father had always treated me as intellectually inferior, as someone who needed his guidance. He wouldn't expect me to understand complex financial structures, let alone exploit them. I began by looking for any public information on David Chen. I found a professional profile that was surprisingly sparse, but it confirmed his long-standing relationship with my father. Then I did something slightly unconventional. I reached out to a former colleague of mine who now worked in corporate forensics. I presented a hypothetical scenario, carefully omitting any personal details. I asked about best practices for investigating financial irregularities within private companies, about methods for tracing misappropriated funds, especially when offshore accounts were involved. My colleague, intrigued by the puzzle, offered valuable insights into forensic accounting techniques, discrete data retrieval methods, and the importance of establishing a clear chain of custody for any evidence. He also mentioned the existence of specialized investigative firms that could assist in such matters, often working on retainer. It was expensive, but if it yielded the proof I needed, it would be worth every penny. The next step was to find a way to get David Chen to cooperate, or at least to unknowingly provide a breadcrumb trail. I remembered my father mentioning that Oratech had used a specific independent auditing firm to, as he put it, ensure transparency and compliance. It was a small boutique firm that specialized in due diligence for emerging tech companies. If they had conducted any audits or financial reviews for Oratech, their records might contain the information I needed. I contacted the firm, posing as a junior associate from a different law firm, working on a pro bono case for a client interested in the history of failed tech startups. I asked for any publicly available reports or anonymized summaries related to Oratech's financial performance.
I was polite, persistent, and armed with enough legal jargon to sound credible. After several days of polite badgering, they finally provided me with a heavily redacted report. Redacted, but not entirely useless. It confirmed the significant capital injection into Oratech from my father's personal investment fund. It also hinted at concerns raised by the auditors regarding the rapid depletion of funds and the lack of clear documentation for certain expenditures. There were footnotes mentioning discrepancies requiring further clarification and recommendations for enhanced internal controls. This was not the smoking gun, but it was a definite sign of trouble. The report also listed David Chen as the primary point of contact for financial queries from the auditors. This was my opening. I decided to orchestrate a meeting with Chen. Not directly, not yet. I knew my father kept a meticulously organized calendar shared with his inner circle. I discovered, through a bit of discreet digital snooping, a skill I'd honed through years of needing to stay one step ahead of my father's pronouncements, that Chen was scheduled to meet with my father at his office on a specific Tuesday afternoon. My plan was to intercept Chen beforehand, away from my father's watchful eye. I managed to get a hold of Chen's personal assistant through a carefully worded email, posing as someone coordinating a charitable golf tournament that my father was sponsoring. I fabricated a message about a last-minute change in the tournament schedule and asked if Mr. Chen would be available for a brief informal chat over coffee near his office on the morning of the 23rd. I gave him a fictional contact number. To my surprise, he agreed. The chosen coffee shop was a quiet, unassuming place in a business district far from my father's opulent towers. I arrived early, my heart pounding a nervous rhythm against my ribs. I'd rehearsed my approach a dozen times. I wouldn't accuse, I wouldn't threaten. I would appeal to his sense of duty, to his professional ethics, and perhaps to his conscience. When David Chen walked in, he was exactly as I'd pictured him, neatly dressed, a little weary around the eyes, carrying a worn leather briefcase. He looked slightly confused when he saw me, not recognizing me immediately. "Sarah, your father mentioned you might be involved with the golf tournament arrangements. I wasn't expecting to meet you here." I offered a practiced, apologetic smile. "Mr. Chen, thank you so much for meeting me. I'm so sorry to bother you. There was a misunderstanding about the tournament logistics. My father is handling the final details, but I wanted to personally apologize for the mix-up. He's incredibly busy, especially with everything surrounding Oratech these days." I watched his face carefully. The mention of Oratech elicited a subtle tightening around his eyes, a fleeting shadow of apprehension. Bingo.
"Oh, Oratech," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Yes, a challenging situation." I leaned forward slightly, lowering my voice. That's actually why I wanted to speak with you, Mr. Chen, in confidence. It's about my inheritance, my grandmother's trust fund. My father informed me recently that the $250,000 was lost due to an investment in Oratech. He suggested it was a calculated risk that didn't pay off. I paused, letting the weight of my words settle. But I've been doing some research, and frankly, the information I'm finding is deeply disturbing. Reports of financial impropriety, significant losses, and I have reason to believe that the investment wasn't just a poor decision on my father's part, but potentially something worse, something that involves misappropriation. I saw a flicker of recognition in his eyes, a guardedness that confirmed my suspicions. He knew more than he was letting on. I understand you were the financial liaison for Oratech during its tumultuous period. My father has always relied on your expertise. I was hoping, as a professional courtesy, and purely hypothetically, of course, if there were any concerns raised internally during that time, any anomalies that you recall, that might shed light on what truly happened to that money. I'm trying to understand the situation before I have to take further action. I let the implication hang in the air. Further action was a subtle but clear threat. He shifted in his seat, his gaze flicking towards the door as if contemplating an escape. Sarah, he began, his voice low, your father is a very powerful man, and I am bound by professional confidentiality agreements. I understand that, Mr. Chen, I replied smoothly, my voice unwavering. But professional confidentiality doesn't extend to illegal activities, does it? And my father, he seemed to imply that I was somehow responsible for the loss, that I was financially irresponsible. That narrative doesn't align with the facts I'm uncovering. I have documentation, Mr. Chen, and I have a recording of my father discussing the matter, a very revealing recording. I'm not looking to make a public spectacle, not at this stage. I'm looking for the truth, and I believe you, as a man of integrity, might hold some of the keys. I watched him closely. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for his coffee cup. He took a long sip, his eyes closed for a moment. When he opened them, there was a resignation there, a quiet surrender. The Oratech situation, he finally said, his voice barely a whisper, was complicated. Your father was very insistent. He saw it as a strategic opportunity, a way to diversify his portfolio, to make a significant return. He was advised by Marcus Thorne. Thorne was very persuasive. He paused, gathering his thoughts. There were discrepancies, significant ones. Funds were moved in ways that were unconventional, and your father was aware. He wasn't entirely ignorant.
He pushed for certain transactions, even when the auditors raised red flags. He was desperate to make it work, Sarah. He needed it to work. My blood ran cold. Desperate. Not just a victim, but a participant, driven by a need to win, to prove himself, to perhaps cover up earlier losses. He needed it to work for whom, Mr. Chen? For himself? Or was he trying to recoup losses from other ventures? I pressed, my voice still quiet, but laced with a new intensity. He sighed, a heavy, weary sound. There were other pressures, other obligations. Thorne had a certain leverage over him, personal, financial leverage. My father was under immense strain. He believed Oratech was the way out. He hesitated, then continued, lowering his voice further. The auditor's final report was heavily edited before it was submitted to your father. Certain critical findings were omitted. I have a copy of the original draft, the one with the full findings. It detailed significant concerns about Thorne's management and your father's direct involvement in authorizing certain high-risk transfers. It suggested the possibility of fraud. He was handing me the smoking gun, the original audit report, the one that detailed my father's complicity. The pieces were falling into place, forming a picture far uglier than I could have imagined. My father hadn't just been duped. He had actively participated in the financial chicanery, likely in an attempt to pay off debts or fund further reckless ventures, all while blaming me for his own failures. The power shift was no longer a subtle shift. It was a seismic event. I had the evidence, I had the truth, and he had no idea how close I was to exposing him. He had gambled with my inheritance, my future, and my trust, and now he was about to learn that some gambles come with a devastating price. I felt a strange calm wash over me, the quiet hum of anticipation before a storm.
The humiliation was a fading echo, the silence was broken, and the control was undeniably, irrevocably mine. The thought of his face when he realized the extent of his miscalculation sent a shiver of grim satisfaction down my spine. He'd wanted to teach me a lesson. Now I was about to teach him one. The air in the coffee shop felt suddenly charged, thick with unspoken secrets and the lingering scent of burnt sugar. David Chen, once a loyal advisor, now looked like a man trapped between a rock and a hard place, his carefully constructed professional facade crumbling before my eyes. He slid a slim, nondescript USB drive across the table. This is a copy of the original audit report, Sarah. The one with Thorne's proposed transactions, the ones your father approved despite the auditor's strong recommendations against them. It also contains emails between Thorne and your father discussing the diversion of funds. Be careful. Your father is not someone you want to cross, and Thorne is dangerous.
His voice was barely audible, a desperate plea for self-preservation mixed with a flicker of genuine remorse. I took the drive, the cool metal a stark contrast to the heat rising within me. This was it, the culmination of weeks of painstaking research, late nights fueled by black coffee and righteous fury, and the quiet, relentless pursuit of truth. I thanked him, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. He seemed relieved, a burden lifted, and I left him there, a small, insignificant figure in the grand scheme of my father's machinations. Walking back to my car, the city traffic seemed to blur into an indifferent backdrop to the seismic shift occurring within me. The sting of humiliation had long since receded, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. The silence I had endured was now a weapon, honed and ready. The control I craved was no longer a distant hope, but a tangible reality, a potent force vibrating in my very bones. My father was hosting his annual summer party at the estate in a few weeks. It was a gaudy affair, a blatant display of his wealth and influence, attended by all the people who mattered in his world, his business associates, his sycophantic friends, and of course, my mother and me, performing our roles as the respectable family. This year, it would be different. This year, the performance would be mine, and the script would be rewritten with undeniable proof of his transgressions. The days leading up to the party were a blur of meticulous preparation. I spent hours poring over the contents of the USB drive. The original audit report was a damning indictment. It detailed not just Thorne's dubious financial practices, but my father's direct involvement in authorizing the transfer of substantial funds under the guise of strategic investments, funds that were ultimately funneled into shell corporations controlled by Thorne. The emails were even more incriminating, filled with coded language about managing liabilities, protecting assets, and ensuring discretion. They painted a picture of a father not just duped, but actively complicit, desperate to maintain his image, and perhaps cover up even earlier, more profound financial failures. The money wasn't just lost, it was siphoned away, leaving Oratech a hollow shell, and my inheritance a phantom. My father's belief that I was too naive, too emotional to understand the intricacies of high finance had been his fatal flaw. He'd underestimated my legal training, my analytical mind, and the sheer depth of my betrayal. He had treated me like a child, lecturing me on prudence while orchestrating his own financial ruin, and then blaming me for the consequences. The injustice of it was a raw wound, but now it was the fuel that propelled me forward. I made several copies of the key documents, encrypting them and storing them on secure, off-site cloud servers.
I also prepared a concise yet devastating summary of the findings, presented in a clear, logical format that left no room for denial. This wasn't about revenge in the petty sense, the kind fueled by fleeting anger. This was about restitution, about reclaiming what was rightfully mine, and about ensuring that the truth, no matter how ugly, saw the light of day. The night of the summer party arrived, cloaked in a warm, humid twilight. The estate buzzed with activity, the air thick with the scent of expensive perfume, grilling steaks, and the low hum of polite conversation. My mother, as always, was a vision of composure, draped in a flowing silk gown, her smile fixed and serene. My father, radiating his usual aura of jovial authority, was already holding court by the pool, his laughter booming across the manicured lawn. I watched them from a distance, a detached observer.
The woman they thought they knew, a ghost of the person I had become. I mingled, playing my part with practiced ease. I offered congratulations on the recent acquisition of a new subsidiary. I made small talk about the weather. I even managed a polite smile for my father when he swept past, clapping me on the shoulder with a proprietary air. He was oblivious, smug in his perceived victory. He had no idea that his carefully constructed world was about to crumble. As the evening wore on and the guests began to gather in the main patio area for the traditional toasts, I knew my moment had arrived. My father, standing on a raised platform, cleared his throat, preparing to deliver his annual spiel about family values, legacy, and the importance of hard work. My mother stood beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. The attendees hushed, their attention fixed on the patriarch. "My dear friends, family," my father began, his voice rich and resonant. "Another year, another glorious celebration of all that we have built together. It is a testament to our dedication, our vision, and our unwavering commitment to excellence. We stand on the shoulders of giants, and it is our duty to ensure that the foundations we've laid are strong enough to support generations to come." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the crowd, a flicker of pride in his eyes. "And speaking of foundations and of legacy," he continued, his voice shifting, taking on a slightly more somber tone, "I want to address something that has been on my mind. My daughter, Sarah, as many of you know, recently celebrated her 25th birthday, and with that milestone came the responsibilities of her inheritance, a significant sum entrusted to her by her grandmother. Now, as you know, the investment climate has been challenging, and unfortunately, a substantial portion of that inheritance was tied up in a venture that, regrettably, did not pan out as planned. It was a calculated risk, a bold step into the future, and while the outcome was not what we hoped for, it is a harsh lesson in the realities of the financial world."
Sarah, I know this has been difficult, but I am proud of how you are learning to navigate these waters. He beamed at me, a look of performative paternalism that made my stomach churn. The crowd offered a smattering of sympathetic applause. My mother squeezed his arm, her expression a carefully cultivated blend of concern and understanding. They had rehearsed this. This was the moment he intended to deliver the final blow, to paint me as the naive heir who lost it all, reinforcing his narrative of my supposed irresponsibility. But I wasn't listening to his words anymore. I was watching the subtle shift in his posture, the slight tightening of his jaw, the almost imperceptible flicker of anxiety beneath his practiced smile. He expected tears, perhaps a quiet, dignified acceptance of his judgment. He was about to get something far more devastating. I walked towards the platform, my heels clicking deliberately on the stone patio. The polite applause died down, replaced by a ripple of surprised murmurs. All eyes turned to me. My father's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before snapping back into place. "Sarah, darling, perhaps you'd like to say a few words to our guests?" he prompted, his voice laced with that familiar, condescending warmth. I reached the edge of the platform and turned to face the assembled guests, my father and mother beside me, their faces frozen in expectant smiles. I took a deep breath, the cool night air filling my lungs. The world seemed to hold its breath. "Thank you, Father," I said, my voice clear and amplified by the outdoor sound system. My father inclined his head, a proud father acknowledging his daughter. "You've spoken of legacy, of foundations, and of calculated risks. And you're right, Father, the investment climate has been challenging. But the venture you're referring to, the one that supposedly cost me my inheritance, wasn't just a challenging investment. It was a deliberate act of financial deception. And the sum lost wasn't $250,000. It was the entirety of my grandmother's trust, nearly double that amount. And it wasn't lost, it was stolen." The murmurs intensified, laced with shock. My father's smile vanished, replaced by a look of cold fury. My mother's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with a dawning horror. "You see," I continued, my gaze fixed on my father, ignoring the growing chaos around us. "My father has a knack for narrative. He spins tales, he controls perception. He told me the money was lost due to a bad investment in a tech startup called Oratech, a story he conveniently presented after I turned 25, just as the funds were to be released to me, a story that conveniently placed the blame on my alleged lack of financial acumen." I pulled a slim, elegant folder from my jacket pocket. The polished wood gleamed under the soft patio lights. "This," I announced, holding it up for all to see, "is the original audit report for Oratech." Not the redacted, sanitized version my father commissioned, but the unvarnished truth, provided to me by an accountant who valued integrity over loyalty. I opened the folder, revealing the first page, the damning title clearly visible. This report,
dated just weeks before Oratech's spectacular collapse, details significant financial irregularities, questionable expenditures, and direct recommendations against further investment. It explicitly raises concerns about the management and the potential for fraud. And crucially, it details my father's direct authorization of numerous diversions of capital, funds that were not invested but siphoned off. The crowd was silent, a sea of stunned faces. My father's face was ashen, his eyes darting wildly, searching for an escape that wasn't there. The emails included with this report, I went on, my voice gaining strength, paint an even clearer picture. They detail conversations between my father and one Marcus Thorne, the so-called Chief Operations Officer of Oratech. Conversations that discuss the management of liabilities and the protection of personal assets. They reveal my father wasn't just a victim of a bad investment, he was an active participant. He approved these transfers, knowing full well they were questionable, perhaps even illegal. He was desperate to recoup other losses, desperate to maintain an illusion of success, desperate to control the narrative, and, it seems, to silence me. I took another step forward, my voice ringing out across the stunned standees. My father, the man who lectured me on financial responsibility, who claimed to be safeguarding my inheritance, was the architect of its destruction. He manipulated me, he lied to me, and he attempted to humiliate me to cover his own tracks. He used my grandmother's legacy and my trust as collateral for his own reckless gambles. I paused, letting the weight of my words sink in. The air crackled with unspoken accusations. My father was sputtering, trying to form words, but only a strangled gasp escaped his lips. My mother, tears streaming down her face, looked utterly broken. The recording I made, I said, my voice dropping to a lower, more intimate tone, addressing my father directly, the one you thought was just an emotional outburst from your naive daughter, contained your own confession. Your admission that the money was gone, that it was an investment that didn't pay off. A far cry from the truth, isn't it? I held up the USB drive. This contains everything. The original audit, the emails, the bank transfer records showing precisely where the money went. Every shell corporation, every dubious transaction. All evidence that will be presented to the relevant authorities. I'm not seeking public shaming, Father, though you've certainly earned it. I'm seeking justice. I'm seeking the return of what is mine, and the accountability you've so skillfully avoided for years.
A choked sob escaped my mother. My father finally found his voice, a raw, guttural sound. You traitor! You wouldn't dare! Oh, but I would, Father, I replied, my voice chillingly calm. Because you didn't just betray my inheritance. You betrayed my trust. You betrayed my grandmother's memory. And you betrayed the very principles you claim to uphold. You taught me to be a lawyer, to fight for what's right. And that's exactly what I'm doing. I turned back to the assembled guests, my voice steady and firm. I apologize for the unpleasantness. This is not how I envisioned my 25th birthday celebration. But sometimes the truth must be spoken, however uncomfortable. My father has a great deal to answer for, and I intend to ensure he does. Thank you. I dropped the folder onto the platform and walked away, leaving behind a tableau of utter devastation. My father stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. My mother was sobbing uncontrollably, clinging to his arm as if for support, though it was clear he had none to give. The guests, a mixture of shock, horror, and morbid fascination etched on their faces, began to disperse, murmuring amongst themselves, their polite facade shattered. As I walked through the open doors of the estate and out into the cool, quiet night, the sounds of their panicked whispers and my father's enraged shouts faded behind me. The air was clear now, the humid twilight replaced by a crisp, starlit sky. The weight of years of deception, of unspoken resentment, of manufactured self-doubt, lifted from my shoulders. I had walked into a gilded cage, feeling like a victim, and I was walking out a victor. The path ahead wouldn't be easy. Legal battles were rarely clean, but I had the truth, I had the evidence, and I had an unshakable resolve.
The humiliation was a distant memory. The silence was a weapon I had wielded with precision. And the control was absolute, irrefutable. The money was just a symbol. The real victory was reclaiming myself, my integrity, and my peace. I took a deep, steadying breath, the scent of freedom filling my lungs. It tasted like the end of one life and the exhilarating, terrifying beginning of another.